We would at this juncture take our keynote address, and it's a privilege, my friends, for us to welcome one of Africa's, and I dare say, he's a global icon. And this man is celebrated not just in Canada but across the world for his impact on education. And let me read for you a very brief profile on him. And as we welcome him, we would respectfully ask that when Nana comes after his speech, he will take his seat here, and then he will be joined by 3 gallant women, and then we'll shortly go into our... Today we are sandwiching him between 3 women, so... And then we'll go into our open discussion. But a very brief profile on our keynote speaker. He is a renowned educator, researcher, and writer who is considered by many as one of Canada's foremost scholars on race, anti-racism studies, black and minority education, African indigeneity, and anti-colonial thought. He is a widely sought-after academic, researcher, and community worker whose professional and academic work has led to many Canadian and international speaking invitations in USA, Europe, and Africa. Currently, he is Professor of Social Justice Education and Director of the Center for Integrative Anti-Racism Studies at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education of the University of Toronto. One other distinguishing factor or note about our keynote speaker is that he was installed as a traditional chief here in Ghana, specifically as the Jasehine of the town of Asokore in Koforidua in the New Dwabin traditional area. His true name is Nana Edusei Sefa Dei. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me welcome Nana Professor George Sefa Dei.
You did kind of message na Tridampon abatrainment over her. Na pinsu, Nanan Medican for Conservative Trainship. Nankuma BD, the paper. I just want to begin by asking the ancestors to view this, and also to ask the Almighty to be in our midst. It is indeed a great honor to be asked to be the keynote speaker for this important event. And I'm at home because there's family here. Emmanuel is my younger brother. My younger brother too, from Canada is also here. NS. I have my eldest from Asokore who are here. I think my sister is also here, Olivia. I think she's here. Yeah. From England, she's here. And then my women's group, my youth group, they are all here. And I think this is a very important time for us. And of course, my friends and colleagues, Nana Hima Amma, and then Candice, who I know are all here. So this is so great. And I should also mention, because I'm going to be in trouble when I get back to Toronto, my PhD student, Ben is here. Ben, where are you? Just raise your hand. Where's she? Okay, maybe she just stepped out, right? Here. Let us, and I'm not going to, because I think it's more to speak with you is more important. We shouldn't forget the significance of this moment, right? Particularly when some of our leaders continue to be colonial stooges who cannot even stand up, right? They continue to be stooges. And I think the education system that we have has been as the leaders that we have today. Right? And we need to rethink critically about how we talk about leadership in Africa, where we have to go back, reclaim, reflect, and then project onto the future if we want the leaders. Now, it's also very, very important speaking about, and my theme is on indigenous leadership, but I'm also interested in the implications for women, right? And you don't want to be very, very patronizing when we talk about women in leadership, because they have been, they continue to be. And if we men can't get the job done, let's get out of the way for the women to continue to do what they're doing in that. See, when I talk to my students and any audience, I talk about the challenges that face us as African peoples. And it's a question of how do we think through the future that we want, and we work collectively to make it possible. I call that the politics of featuring. How do we think through the future that we want? Nobody is going to do it for us. We have to do it for ourselves. And it's our responsibility to think through the solutions that we have for the problems that affect us. This is the politics of featuring. And I talk about the power of speculative imaginaries. We must imagine, but we are fortunate. We don't have to imagine too far because we have a past to go by, our African indigeneity to go by in this regard. You know, sometimes people talk about the impact of colonialism. Of course, the impact of colonialism is that it's not ended, it's still ongoing. But I think the challenge for us is how do we resist? How do we use our own knowledge? How do we use our history? How do we use our culture? How do we use our traditions to resist the ongoing coloniality that we face within our communities? And this is where I think there's a need for a paradigm shift. And I think I see Africa as at the forefront of this paradigm shift in this third series on leadership. How do we take Africa seriously, as others have said? We take Africa seriously by beginning to know that Africa is a place of learning. Africa is a place of knowledge. Africa is a source of generation of a wealth of knowledge that can help us deal with the contemporary problems. Africa also has something to give humanity. That's what I call the beneficence of Africa to global humanity. And therefore, we need to broaden the question of leadership in Africa to include indigenous perspectives if we are serious about thinking about the question of leadership on the continent. We need leadership that works with our cultures, that works with our traditions. It doesn't mean everything about our past is fine and dandy. We need to be very, very critical because we know that when we look at our past, there are signs of disempowerment. There are signs of basically putting others down, and we need to be very, very critical about that. But there are also signs of empowerment, signs of resistance, signs when we begin to appreciate what it means to be African, because that gets us into questions about the collectivism that we have as a people, where we look out for each other, where we see ourselves as communities, not as individuals, where greed is not something that is told or something that is basically welcomed in our community, but questions of relationality, reciprocity, sharing, acknowledging the value of each other is more important than questions of personal gain, comfort, exploitation, and division. And so I'm asking us, in the words of Africa, to reframe leadership discourse around African cultural legitimacy. What does it mean to reframe African leadership around the question of African cultural legitimacy? It means to me bringing historical insights on African leadership that bear on the current debate about even African development and African democratic governance. But I'll be remiss if I don't say a few things about the question of the indigeneity. Because we seem to be a people as Africans. We are not allowed to talk about our African indigeneity. That somehow we lost our indigeneity because of colonization. Indigeneity is not stuck in the past. We still live in it today. This is why in the Akan language we have something called Sankofa. You go back and you fetch which is relevant to understand the contemporary. So we have to resist what I call the colonial appellation of the indigenous, that somehow we have lost our indigeneity because of colonization. We have not. Also, this idea of science indigenous binary. We have to break that binary. You know, how people go, well, this is indigenous, the other thing is science. where we have indigenous science, right? I spoke at Legon in the first symposium organized by Nana Hima, right? And I was making the point that when we look at our cultures, our technology, our sciences, those are powerful knowledge systems that we can work with. And it's very, very important for us to embrace that. But you know, there's also the open hostility, and I sometimes even I find it among us as African scholars and African peoples. You know, when I was being introduced, they mentioned about how I get to speak in many, many places. Sometimes when I speak, I get the tough questions about African indigeneity from Africans in the audience, that somehow we have lost our indigeneity. Right? I remember a long time ago, I was on a panel with the late Winnie Mandela of South Africa, right? And we were talking about the question of indigeneity, and somebody in the audience who was an African said, you know, in this day when people are talking about tractors, bulldozers, George Day wants us to go back to the cutlass and the hoe, right? And Winnie said, you know, George, I'm not going to answer that. I'm going to respond to this question for you. Nobody's asking us to go back to the cutlass and the hoe. What we're saying is that there's a powerful knowledge system that we can look through, we can interrogate, we can investigate, and we can bring to birth in the current situation. That's what we're talking about. So it's very, very important, because at the end of the day, there was a world before Europe. There was a world before Europe. Europe is not the advent of human history. There was a world before Europe. And this is why we need to talk about African indigeneity in this context. When I came in, I had some discussion about, and I think our Madam Chairperson was talking about the history we go back. We need to go back to African history and look at our female leaders, right? I think if you look at African history, whether we look at indigenous pre-colonial Africa, there was the existence of these centralized kingdoms, empires and chiefdoms and communities with formal state and informal state structures. Community leaders were chosen from tradition and culture, and leadership was not strictly by personal attributes. Leadership was not by personal attributes. Neither was leadership about hierarchical ranking. Neither was leadership about binary in terms of who is a leader and who is a follower. A leader is also a follower, and a follower is also a leader. So those binaries were not in existence, and we have documentation around that to prove. We had leaders whose power and authority rested on hereditary lineage, sometimes religious and spiritual roles that they played, their valor in war and battle, and even in crisis. The leader and the subject are not bound together in relations of hierarchical superiority. We are bound together in relations of what I call dialectical asymmetries. So the leader and the subject were together to make a whole. The two were powerfully connected, were combined in that regard. And difference with a leader is on the basis of ancestral spiritual sanctioning of the role of the leader. In other words, the leader is seen as somebody who is an embodiment of wisdom, an embodiment of thinking about the community welfare, an embodiment that thinks spiritually about the well-being of the community. We don't have that among our leaders today. Our leaders are more concerned about personal gain. They're more concerned about the greed, about how much they can make, rather than thinking about the communities that they are part of and helping build these communities. Such leadership I'm talking about, to the contrary, was community-driven. It was community-based, and it was culturally coded and spiritually anchored. And this is something that we need to basically think through if we're going to bring it to birth in the contemporary situation. I think it's very, very important when we look at history, right? African history, and this is using some of the words of one of my PhD students, who is actually a doctor now, Dr. Kumo, right? We have the King Nefertari of Kemet, ancient Egypt, and we know her achievements. We also had Queen Idia of Benin Kingdom, the Edo people in Nigeria. Then Queen Muhumuza of Rwanda and Uganda in the early 1900s. Phenomena of Zaria, Nigeria. Of course, our own Yasantua. Makeda, Queen of Sheba, Ethiopia, Yemen. Nzingu Mbambe of Angola. Ajazoro of Ife, Nigeria. Dia in Algeria. And there are many, 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 many of these female leaders who were concerned more about their people's welfare, who helped build communities, very strong, powerful communities that were able to address the concerns of their people. Can we learn from the leadership skills of this rich history as we move forward to the contemporary? The question I ask is, what has happened with such rich history of African women leadership? Where did we go wrong? What happened? And we need to investigate, we need to interrogate, because we have a history to go by and to learn from it. And this is why I think the Ubuntu philosophy becomes very, very important. The Ubuntu philosophy. The idea of being the self through others. You're only human through the humanity of others. That's so powerful, to be human through the humanity of others. It means if you do something wrong to the other person, you're only doing it yourself. You are human only through the humanity of others. And it's very, very important for us to work with this philosophy. Leadership in this philosophy is co-creating inclusive communities with ethical responsibilities to each other and to our diverse communities. Ubuntu also stresses the reciprocal, the relationality that I talked about. The reciprocal, the relationality, that leadership is privileging community legacy or community legitimacy in order for social action to be effective. Ubuntu has this philosophy of practice which says we need to append our mental enslavement. And sometimes part of the problem is that we've been so mentally enslaved, right, that what we have, we disregard it and take on something which doesn't serve our purpose. Right? And it's when we come to politics, questions of governance, we have systems of government which really don't serve our purpose. And we have been mentally enslaved to follow it because this is what we believe is the right thing for us to do. And that has always been a problem in this regard. And this is why I think we need to conceptualize the question of leadership. And I think this is where education is so important in that regard. You know, earlier when I said our education system today has given us the leaders that we have. So we have to start with our education system. And in starting for education system, I have to go back to the late Mkondari when she says, the crisis of development, any crisis of development in Africa is a crisis of African higher education. And I've written about this, Molifia, something others I've talked about, you know, and I said this in Legon last week, right? We have universities in Africa. We don't have African universities. They are not the same. We have universities in Africa, of course, but they are not African universities because they are colonial satellites of the Western Academy. They are colonial satellites. They are copying everything that the West does. And if we want to be serious about taking Africa seriously, then we want our institutions to be so Africanized, to be so indigenized, to work with our knowledge system, to think through solutions to our problem, and not simply looking elsewhere for answers to our problem. I think there's an imperative here. Sometimes the imperative calls for us to be very, very critical of certain discourses. You know, these days people hear about Africa rising, right? Africa is rising. Africa is rising for whom? Africa is rising for whom? Not for its people. It's rising for corporate interests. It's rising for the West. And we need to be honest and frank and speak about that. There's an abysmal failure of Western style of leadership in post-colonial Africa, here. And this is why we need to traditionalize our institutions. We need to traditionalize our institutions. We need to traditionalize our institutions. And African indigenous leadership can no longer be marginalized in debates about African political governance and development. We need a new brand of African political leadership that is built on indigenous and Afrocentric principles, where we are looking for culturally relevant and responsive forms of indigenous leadership. A leadership that exhibits knowledge, skills, practices, processes that facilitate locally determined needs and aspirations and work to achieve collective goals and outcomes for a collective good. An African-centered leadership that enhances local communities' abilities to achieve viable and sustainable socio-historical and political outcomes, which is not grounded in Eurocentric modernity. A new African leadership that comes to birth through critical scholarship, through anti-colonial research, that works with the operations of civil society and everyday governance. Leadership that is grounded in African histories and African historiographies. A new leadership that is anchored in our indigenities, our local creativity, and our resourcefulness. A new leadership that is sustained in youth academies. This is why the whole presence of the youth here is so important. We're sustained in youth academies. It's sustained in civic education, where questions of age, gender, inclusiveness is taken seriously, not simply lip service. Africa talks about a thought leadership, yes, but it's a thought leadership that is futuristic, is forward-looking. Very, very futuristic, is forward-looking. It's a leadership that is listening, listens. It's leadership that is creative and resourceful. It's also intentional. The whole question, leadership that is intentional. In other words, it's purposeful. It's intentional to solve problems. Leadership that is intentional to solve problems. So we are people who come to leadership with the intention that they want to solve problems, not leadership that comes in with the intention of reproducing problems. The two are not the same. Leadership that empowers our youth to be resistors. Our youth to be resistors, to be change agents, but also fostering continental and diasporic African unity. Now, I know this forum talks about implications for women, and I just want to make a few comments here. I think situating women in leadership discussions needs to go beyond the sterile debates about gender and development. It needs to go beyond questions about culture and traditions as part of the problem. It needs to go beyond that. Right? I think, to me, as I said, we have a rich history to go by. We have women who have traditionally held and still hold leadership roles and positions in local communities. The female heads, the clan heads, the matriarchs, the market women, the spiritual leaders. We're all women. Women have navigated leadership positions, working with both written and unwritten rules, and using codes of mothering. Earlier when I talked about the men should get out of the way, I'm talking about these codes of mothering. The caring, right? Our leaders don't care. Our leaders today don't care. We need leaders who care. And that can only come when you work with the spirit of mothering. I've never seen a mother who never cares for their child. Women leadership that exhibits networks, recognizing the shifting positionalities in context of community building. We need to learn from women who have been leaders and are still leaders. What are their experiences that they have gone through? You can't talk about creating a corps of female leaders when those who are in leadership roles, we don't understand the experiences they have gone through and how they have dealt with the challenges that they have encountered. We have women in leadership positions whose voices are very important in these discussions because they will tell us about their experiences of being in some of these institutions, sometimes these patriarchal institutions, and how they have navigated around these institutions. I think we know that colonialism and patriarchy continue to be consequential for women's traditional leadership roles in communities. They continue to be consequential. But it's important for us to understand women's leadership realities and resistances within the patriarchal and the post-colonial context. We also need to place some utmost importance on women's voices, understandings, and their experiences and challenges of leadership. To learn from successful women approaches to leadership and how they have overcome barriers and built sustainable support networks. And to understand the sociocultural context of women leadership and how this sometimes is compounded by neoliberal policies and the liberal proclivities, as well as the resistances that ensue from women's grassroots mobilizations. Just the last session to conclude is, I think, the question of social policy modeling, which is very, very important for youth leadership. Because we're talking about, and I always talk about this point. Some of us, we are on our way out. But the young ones who are coming before us are the ones who have to be the change agents. And that's why we need to pay attention to this modeling youth leadership. So we need social policy modeling that seeks to traditionalize and indigenize our institutions, which extend beyond formal educational system. As I said earlier on, the fact is that our colonial education system has produced the type of leaders that we have today. That means we have to rethink our educational system. We also have to highlight African-centered education that emphasizes the spiritual and the metaphysical connections of human existence. And the codes of womanhood, humanism, mothering in our indigenous cultures. Educating our young learners about African indigeneities, our histories, and our cultures, our traditions, our rights. See, this point about educating our youth about our cultures and our histories, right? Many of our youth do not know about our rich histories. Because in the school system, they don't learn about our rich histories. And we need to educate them about our rich histories if we want to talk about civic, social responsibilities from this youth. Also, the question of youth moral and character education is important as an entry point. Don't expect to get leaders who are for the welfare of the community if morally and in character education there's a lack of thinking about somebody. They will think about themselves. We also need youth, and I'm talking of both male and female, leadership training camps, youth academies of leadership, think tanks, which is modeled with an indigenous anti-colonial gaze. Right? Sometimes you can have these workshops, you can have these seminars, but if discussions are so steeped in Eurocentric thought, you're only reproducing the problem. You have to be steeped in Afrocentric, in anti-colonial, in an indigenous framework. We need policy framework for youth service instilling leadership, which will bring questions of service and social responsibility. Youth mentorship with elders. How do youth connect with our elders? Our elders, our traditional leaders, to develop skills about accountability, ethics, respect, and humility. Adult and community education. It's going to be important. The conferences that we have, such as this, the workshops that we have, the public forums that we have, that educate about these issues. Even the use of popular culture, performing arts in teaching about some of these ideas become very, very important. and using pedagogies of the land. When I talk of pedagogies of the land, I mean land teachings that have to do with relationality, reciprocity, respect, humility, generosity, sharing. Those are the pedagogies of the land. Because those are the things that will get us to the leaders we want. Leaders who care about sharing, who care about reciprocity, who cares about building mutual interdependence, who cares, leaders who care about respecting the dignity of people. And developing strategies for leadership succession, and as I said earlier on, learning from the experiences of women in transformative leadership roles. So to conclude, some concluding thoughts. I see all of us here as African learners, we are African scholars, we are field practitioners. And Kojo Yanka to me is so famous in this, that we must begin to pioneer new analytical systems, unquote, for understanding our own communities, steeped in our own homegrown cultural perspectives, unquote. I think to me the power of this is that we must smile with our own teeth. Smile with your own teeth. Don't use somebody's teeth to smile. Smile with your own teeth. We must also ask the question, what communities do we want and are willing to fight for? What communities do we want and are willing to fight for? Are we just going to sit with what is happening and not resist? If we want different communities, then we must fight for it. We cannot be silent about it. We must fight for it. Place an emphasis on youth leadership development so that our youth will get rid of the inherited colonial knowledge that the school system has imbued in them. And also to think through the particular discursive lens that we use when we engage in these discussions. Because the lens is also very important. That's why the paradigm shift is important. Because the type of questions we ask will get us to the right solutions. If we ask the wrong questions, you get to the wrong solution. Finally, to embrace the power of land and earthly teachings. These are literacies of relationality, sharing, reciprocity, social responsibility, accountability. That helps us to subvert colonial hierarchies and create what I have called ethical learning subjects. Ethical learning subjects. Very, very important. We need ethical leaders. And you can get ethical leaders when you become ethical learning subjects. And as they say in Kiswahili, asante sana. Thank you.